Hi everyone, it's Simon Peters, Project Manager for Walking the Way, Living the Life of Jesus Today. Walking the Way is the United Reformed Church's focus on whole of life discipleship, and it's all about helping people to work out what it means to be a disciple of Jesus in the context of their everyday lives. I sat down on Zoom with Jacob Bali, a special category minister in London, focusing on work in the community and helping people to live out their lives as disciples of Jesus. I started by asking Jacob to introduce himself and a little bit about what his work involves.
I'm Reverend Jacob. I'm the Special Category Minister based at Crossway Christian Centre United Reformed Church in London. And my role is very much intertwined and connected with walking the way, living the life of Jesus today. And that's the reason why I'm taking part in this discussion today.
Brilliant. Um, could you maybe tell us a bit more about what your role involves day to day? I mean, sort of who you work with and what you're kind of aiming to achieve with them.
Yep. So Crossway is a community church, Crossway Christian Centre. So we are located right in the middle of Elephant and Castle, a developing location with lots of different shops and universities, campuses, and all sorts. And so my role specifically is to be the link or the engagement between the church and the local community. And so my week, really, there's no real structure to it. It varies every single week. So aside from the normal ministerial duties with the local church and preaching, I'm also working alongside people in the community. So going to other the council, for example, taking part in interfaith discussions, going to the local hospitals and helping with the chaplaincy teams there, and going to youth groups and clubs. And I've been interviewed by the BBC in London, BBC Radio London, and also taken part in initiatives with the British Science Association and the NHS. So it really varied, and no week looks the same. No 2 weeks look the same. They're constantly changing. Yeah.
That sounds really amazing. That obviously you're involved with all these different groups and organisations in the community, and so very much at the heart of where people are living out their lives every day, and facing the realities we all face each day. It sounds like your ministry is very much based within that reality.
Mm.
What kind of reception do you find in the community? Are people open to the idea that God might have a role to play in terms of that everyday reality? Are there people who tend to be quite skeptical or wonder what's the church up to? What's it all about? What kind of
Mm.
response do you get?
Yeah, I think it may surprise you. Um, it's not really, the responses I've received have mostly been surprise
Mm,
that the church actually want to be involved. Not really negative and not really positive, more indifferent surprise, like, oh, I didn't realize Christians think like that or would want to do that, or that I could go to the local church with support, especially with the COVID situation. So the responses I've often been met with is surprise, confusion, but also intrigue as to why are you here, or why are you helping with the food bank, or um, what is it that what does this have to do with you as a church? And so I
mm,
think a lot of people today, especially, don't have as much of a Christian background, especially where I am, as they had in the past. And so there are many questions, a lot of questions. And I've learned as well that many people are open to know about Jesus. So walking the way, living the life of Jesus today, have many questions about who is Jesus, and why are you doing what you do as a Christian? Yeah. So that's the response I usually get, is surprise.
mm. That's really interesting to hear. Yeah, that you get a response of surprise from people outside the church that Christians want to be involved in their lives and what's going on, and to offer a positive input to that.
Mm.
But also an openness from people and questions that they've got about faith, that perhaps they haven't been able to answer before. So that's really interesting to hear. Um, wonder what the response is like inside the church, because of course, the church as an institution is quite famous for getting sort of wrapped up in its own processes, and of course focusing on the worship of God, but perhaps as a result of that, less so on the community or on looking outwards. Church does tend to be quite inward looking. What's the response been from the church to the ministry that you've offered, which is obviously very much looking outward into the community?
Really good question. I would I would put it in the context of discipleship, especially with walking the way, and pastoral care. And I think that there is still within the institution a division or almost a stigma attached with, if you're doing discipleship, it's not necessarily pastoral care. And I found much of the conversations I've been having with people have been pastoral. What does it mean for me that God allowed this to happen? Or how may God help me with this? And those questions I see as very much a pastoral one. And I think, especially with the coronavirus pandemic, many of the structures that we have built within our denomination have not really enabled or have not facilitated a conversation around discipleship beyond the local congregation. And so I've had mixed responses within the church, some people very positive, but some of it very skeptical.
It's
Mm,
always been a challenge to push forms of ministry and service which look outward into the community. Which is a shame, really, because discipleship, being followers of Jesus, is surely what we're all about, equipping people for following Jesus in their own everyday lives. I just want to ask you very openly. The strap line of walking the way is living the life of Jesus today. And I just
mm,
want to ask you, what does that mean to you personally?
mm. For me personally, it may sound a bit cliche, but for me it means living out the good news, the gospel, and taking that good news with me as I go out and interact with people. When I was studying at the theological college for ministry, the lecturer would often ask, after we say give a statement or a sermon, where is the good news? And I think that that is the thing that stuck with me, even in ministry, that whatever I'm doing, I'm being a light into the darkness, or salt and light, that analogy that Jesus gave. And how am I sharing the good news day to day? And so I think that would be what I would say, finding the good news and living out the good news.
The thing I love about that is that because we are created in the image of God,
Mm,
we all have good news to share. God is at work in our lives, whether
mm,
we realize it or not.
mm,
And that all the things we do, no matter how big or small, God is working through those things to build a
mm,
vision of justice and peace
mm,
for all people. And that is
mm,
surely good news that everyone can rejoice in.
mm,
But of course, when we talk about sharing the good news and the E word, evangelism,
mm,
all sorts of ideas can come up. And quite often we can have a misconception of evangelism as being forcing our beliefs on someone else, or, you know, presenting the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, in a
mm,
very forceful way. But I know that in the work you do, you're doing quite a lot to subvert that view of evangelism. And I
mm.
suppose I'd just like to know more about what evangelism means to you in the context of your ministry.
Mm. Yep, I think it's directly connected to the last question and
Mm.
answer. So, without getting too technical, but going back to the Greek that inspired the word in English, euangelion, and that is to be one who takes good news. And also, I think discipleship is tied into all of that. And to put evangelism for me as simply to its simplest form is to simply share that good news with people, not without expecting anything in return, without trying to gain anything, or to convert people into my image, so to speak. Just simply sitting down with people, having a conversation, meeting them where they are, and telling them about who is this Jesus that I believe in, and what does it actually mean to love your neighbor as yourself, and love God, first of all, and love your neighbor as yourself. So I think that's how I would answer your question.
That's great. I'm just thinking about some of the elements of your ministry. It does sound very similar in some ways to the ministry of church-related community work. But I can also see that there are elements that you bring as a minister of word and sacraments to this role, in terms of particularly pastoral care, as you've mentioned, and helping people to understand more of the Word of God and the Bible. Do you feel that being a minister of word and sacraments, and that being your calling, gives you something unique that you can bring to community outreach?
I do. And with all of the utmost respect to my CRCW colleagues, I think that a minister of word of sacrament has a different emphasis and onus in the way that they approach outreach and work in the community. And so, as a minister of word and sacrament, I think those two are the pillars that keep us grounded as a minister of word and sacrament. And it's from that context of scripture preaching, but also of baptism and Holy Communion, that we take out much of what we do in the community. And also as office holders in the church, as representatives of that side of the word and sacraments, I think we always have the theological grounding and also the church polity within acting within what we're doing. So I don't think we ever separate ourselves truly from that side of things, where I think a CRCW is able and freed to work independently in a community in a way that a minister of word and sacrament may not be able to.
Your role sort of offers a powerful reminder that every ministry, regardless of whether it's ministry of word and sacrament, CRCW, eldership, lay preaching, all sorts of callings, it can engage with community and should be engaging with community. That it's not about inward-looking ministries or outward-looking ministries, but how are all of our ministries affected by the need to be outward-looking, to care for our communities, and ultimately, of course, to share the good news that is within us, that God seeks to share. And so, all that you've said very much, I think, emphasizes that. Just to move on to something slightly different, you said recently in a conversation that we were both part of, that especially during this time of COVID, that sharing the good news can be particularly challenging, that we have to be sensitive in the ways that we approach it. How can people share that good news of Jesus that is within us and that we are living out day to day? How can people be more open about sharing that in a time of
COVID? I think when many of us think of sharing good news, we think of standing on a soapbox on a corner or doing big crusades or something like that. But it can actually be as simple as having a conversation with somebody, maybe even talking about the service you've enjoyed recently, or the hymn that you really love, and sharing it with your family and friends. I think it begins at home, really, and it begins with those people you're most comfortable with. And so I think we can also share good news with a phone call, with a Zoom meeting, in small ways, or in any way that you feel enabled to do that. I would encourage, especially in this time that we're in, for people not to put too much stress on yourself to do something big, and likewise not to be afraid of speaking what you really care about with somebody. I'm reminded of the analogy is if somebody goes to a restaurant and they have a really good meal, then they will tell their friends about it. Or if they watch a really good film, and then they would tell their friends about it. And so sharing what we believe as Christians can also be that simple, just sharing what we believe in and something that we really enjoy and feel is really good.
Mm. That's very true, and I also think it's great that we can not just do that with our church experiences, but also with our experiences of God in everyday life.
Mm,
That you know, in as people work, for example, as teachers or
mm,
nurses, or as engineers, or as bus drivers, or you name it.
mm,
There are lots of things that people can do in those roles, which I think are an outward expression of the love of Jesus. And I'm just reminded
mm,
of when I was at school, and one day I needed to get the public bus to meet my mum somewhere, and I went into my wallet and realised that I had no money at all.
mm,
And the bus driver not only let me on the bus, he actually gave me some money from his float and said,
mm,
if your mum isn't there to meet you, uh, get some food,
mm,
because you'll be hungry. And the next day, I went and waited for his bus to come so I could give him the money back. And I asked him, why did you do that? Because you
mm,
you didn't need to do that. And he said, well, the good Lord tells us that we need to show kindness to each
mm,
other. And I wanted to show kindness to you.
mm,
And so there we are, a very simple act of kindness, which he really didn't need to do.
mm,
But that was very much about sharing the love of Jesus. And he was able to be confident enough to say, that's why I've done this.
mm,
And I think if more of us had confidence to say these little things we do in our everyday lives
mm,
aren't just nice things that we do, they're there to make the world a better place, because that's who God has created us to be.
mm,
People who make this world a place of justice and peace and love for
mm,
all. And it sounds like your ministry brings you into contact with a lot of people like that, who
mm,
are living their lives every day and who might not realize that God's very much at work through those lives, but God is. And it must be a real privilege to
mm.
be able to support people and recognizing that.
Yes, it definitely is. And what you've said actually reminds me that it's even the simple things as well. Something that we may not realize will have a huge impact on somebody else. And so we should not underestimate what God may do through us. I think many people in our culture, especially, are very are somewhat reserved when it comes to taking any credit or accepting that God may use us. And I think what I see in this ministry is every single day I see how God is using people through food bank and through immigration organizations and charities and different groups. Yeah, so it's something I definitely see as a privilege, and I don't take it for granted.
Mm, absolutely. And it must be great to support people in giving them that courage to recognize God's presence within that, and to respond to that.
Mm,
Just on that, I mean, you've spoken about how we can continue to share the good news in this time of COVID, that these challenging times. I'm just wondering, more generally,
mm,
how we can encourage each other as Christians, that what we have and what's going on in our lives and what God is doing in our lives, no matter how big or small, is worth sharing. How can we encourage our fellow Christians who might not quite have that confidence in their faith to be able to articulate clearly that God is at work in their lives? What can we do to support them?
mm. I'm reminded of the analogy that Jesus himself often gave, referring to the seed that falls in the ground and it grows to bear fruit. And every seed in and of itself is not a tree or it's not a crop, but it is complete. It has everything in it to become something greater, and it will grow in due time. But at that stage, as a seed, it still has value and purpose. And each person who has a walk with God, an encounter with God, an encounter that is truly personal for them, has something that they can share with others. It may not seem like a big um, plant, but yet it's still something valuable and can be shared. And so I would encourage everybody, if there's anything that you think is good news, to share that good news as simply as you can, and not to be afraid of the response that you may get.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about being a disciple, or encouraging people in their discipleship at this time?
I think it sums up the Great Commission, walking the way, living the life of Jesus today. I think it sums up the Great Commission that God has given us to go out, to make disciples, to baptize in his name, sharing good news. I think that is something that every Christian, we can be confident that we can do. And it's something I would encourage us to be more open to do, both outside, but also within the church.
As people don't realize the importance of what they're doing. That visiting someone and handing over food over the gate at a distance is a pastoral visit. And being there for someone who's lonely, or continuing to give donations to the food bank, or give of your time to volunteer. All of this stuff really matters, and it's just difficult to get people to recognize that and share with us about that.
Yeah, I think people definitely, they feel that much of those things, it's almost like we've developed a culture, especially in the URC. I think most URCs, you go on a URC website, and the thing you see the most is the photo of the church building.
Yeah.
There's not really anything about the people. It doesn't show anything about the people. And so I think that's also something that is reflected in the way that we see our interaction with the church, is actually with the church building. And now we're being forced to look at church differently. I think many people are starting to, I don't know, I think we have to start to have a new conversation about what does it mean to be church when we're not in the building anymore. And I think that's where we come in, helping people to realize actually all of those things, whether we know it or not, are actually an expression of our faith and what we believe.
Thank you so much, Jacob. If you have a story about discipleship or living out your faith that you'd like to share, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email to wtw@urc.org.uk, or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Until next time, stay safe. See you soon.